Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Design Journal. I'm excited to be here tonight. I did an experiment this week. Instead of pushing out an invite to every single person in the Cool Name RPG Facebook group, I didn't do that to see if it made a difference. I'm curious tonight to see how many folks show up and whether we get as big of a crowd as we normally do, if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess we're actually starting, so I can hide the starting soon banner at this point. So I should be in pretty good shape there. But let me just take care of a couple of pieces of detail there. All right, now I've got my nice background and everything. So anyway, welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you, everyone who's here watching today. Thank you, all of you who are tuning in later. Also, hello to Master of the Game, Juice. Nice to see you here again tonight. And make sure to check out his podcast as well. I mean, his YouTube channel as well. It's fantastic. A great capture of gaming ideas and information and cool games. So, all right, so let me get into things. First off, I'm doing Casual Thursday. I'm finally going to start breaking out some of my cool nerdy t-shirts. This is an all-time favorite, the old Star Wars Darth Vader TIE Fighter. Let me tell you what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to be talking about some general information about what's been going on for me and where I'll be over the next few weeks and over the next couple of months. Also, we're going to be talking about project stuff, just what's going on with the Kickstarter project in general, some of the nuts and bolts of how things are going. We're also going to be talking a little bit about our Tome of Requirements, where we're at on that. And then we're going to start, we're going to mention a little bit about the general advice I've asked our consulting designers for. And finally, we're going to get into some design talk. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about HP and wounds. We've touched on this before, but we've got a lot of good feedback that I've been pulling out of our Discord conversation. And so I'm going to be touching on that a little bit tonight. So let me jump into things here. First off, I am going to be in May, I think it's May 11th to 13th, at the International Congress on Medieval Studies. So if any of you are going to be there, you let me know, and I'll look for you while I'm there. This is one of my absolute favorite things. I attend as an independent scholar on a regular basis. It's an academic, it's one of the two largest. The other one is in Leeds, and of academics gathering together to talk about medieval studies in general. And it's everything from music to economics to daily life to myth to you name it. And there's just hundreds of sessions and some amazing people just doing some really incredible research and sharing it at this event. So this is a really cool event. I'm going to be there. I will report on it when I get back and let everyone know how it goes. And as a Michigan native myself and a guy living near in Ann Arbor area, this is a pretty easy one for me to get to. So obviously that's a benefit as well. Leeds, little tougher. I attended Leeds when it was all online during COVID, but hopefully someday I can get to that as well. So that's the first thing I wanted to tell you guys about. I want to talk a little bit about the Kickstarter itself, give you a little bit of information about what's happening there just from a nuts and bolts perspective. The reason why this is important to me is that I know a lot of folks are thinking about their own projects in the future, things that they want to try to do, ideas they want to try to get up in the air. And I got to tell you, the nuts and bolts of the Kickstarter is, a huge part of this. And it's difficult and challenging, and there are a lot of moving parts. So I like to share some of that as well for all of you who are going to be doing something like this in the future. So first off, surveys. After the Kickstarter, we send out surveys. These surveys ask for things like your shipping address, if you want to do any add-ons or things like that. We're using BackerKit, and BackerKit has set us up with some of their beta functionality right now. And what this means, there's a couple of cool things. First off, we can do the surveys right away, but we don't have to charge for shipping yet, because as you guys know, I like to charge for shipping as close to the shipping date as possible so that we get, we're not like overcharging, or if shipping prices go up somehow, it doesn't destroy the project. I've seen too many projects completely crushed by that. Shouldn't be a big change. We're talking like a couple of dollars here or there, I think, but I still like to do it as close as possible anyway, because I like to be accurate on the things that I'm doing. So the surveys are going to be going out with that. Now, there's a couple of new things you're going to see here that's part of this functionality we get. One of the things you're going to be able to do is change your pledge. So let's say you pledge, you're going to be able to update your pledge, upgrade it. Let's say you pledged at, say, the $15 level, and afterwards you're like, oh, I really wished I would have gotten the hardcover book. This seems like it's going to be so cool, right? You can upgrade your pledge. When you get your survey, you can go in there, you can do an upgrade. I'm pretty sure you can go back in later until we close the pledge manager. You'll be able to go in at any time and do it. But I'm not 100%. I haven't gotten to go through it myself until it goes live to really see what it looks like. But you should be able to go in and make that change at any time, which will be very cool, especially if, let's say, you start, in a few months from now, you're like, oh man, I really want to start my own independent project and use the Cool Name rules once you see what they look like. Well, you could potentially upgrade to one of those publisher pledges. Now, this is also very cool for all of us, and I've mentioned this stuff before, and sometimes I repeat because different folks are watching at different times. But it allows us to get art. This is one of the biggest things, is that this is going to allow us to put art by Russell Marks, the guy who does all the art for World of Vitaltis. He's going to be able to put together some art to go in that core book. And I'm not talking about the Masterwork upgrade. That one we are already planning to illustrate. But I am talking about the core book that's going to go out and be free to the world. This art is going to fall into that category as well. We're going to make it just as free as everything else. So, for example, if he does a picture of an orc, anyone can use that image of the orc in their own product going forward. So this is something very cool that I'm excited to add. It also means we can add more consulting designer hours if we get more funds added to the project. And also it means that we could potentially get people to help write some of the content once we settle on the system, which would be good, because right now it's all me and I can write pretty fast, but it might allow us to get things done a little bit sooner and get it out to all of you. So this is all very cool stuff, and we'll be able to continue to pull in folks into this grand endeavor as we go along. So anyway, surveys are going to be going out. The smoke test went out today, so about 5% of backers should be getting those. You do that test just so that they can make sure that all the systems are working as they're supposed to. So we send that out first, and after that, the rest will go. That'll probably be in the next 24 hours that'll go out. Also, there's going to be late pledging. We talked about that. So that's going to become available as well. And let me just take a look at anything else. Oh, one of the conversations we recently had on Facebook is, what should we do when we're short on design topics to talk about? Because, I've been doing this every week, and some weeks we might be sitting there going well, we kind of just been grinding away on spells this last week. I don't really have too much to share that's new, so we asked folks on the Facebook group just to get an idea of what some of them thought. The number one thing folks wanted us to talk about is just the ideas that you guys have come up in Discord and the other forums. So we've taken that to heart, and I will be talking about some of the Discord feedback we had on hit points and wounds. The second thing that was a tie for that was meeting our consulting designers like we did last week with DBJ. That was awesome. We'll do more of that as we go along as well. So you'll get to meet more of our consulting designers. And then the third place was just general game design discussion, talking about that as well. There was a few other things, not a lot of votes for skipping a week, not really interested in, very few people. Actually, I think I was the only one who voted that I wasn't interested in the design journals. I just voted there because I always vote for all of them, so no one feels lonely if they're the only person who voted for that one. But yeah, also someone said everything playtest related. Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about not having content, playtest discussion is going to be hugely important for us to discuss and talk about here. So anyway, that's all of our project stuff. Nothing too much else to say about that there. So we're going to jump into the next piece of this. We're going to talk about the Tome of Requirements feedback. Now, the consulting designers have until the end of the day today to get me back. I think a couple of them said they're going to get it back a little bit later, but end of day today is when they're supposed to have all their feedback for me. So I don't really have it all for you yet today to talk about, unfortunately. I wish I could start talking about it. But what it means is that I'm going to use that feedback. I'm going to do a final revised edition of the Tome of Requirements, and we're going to put out our final Tome of Requirements probably Monday, Tuesday of next week. So I'm going to work on it this weekend. I know we're getting feedback from Andrew Marlowe, Stephen Long, Robin Laws, and DBJ. All four of those are going to be giving us feedback. Remember remember that we asked the designers what sort of things they wanted to provide feedback on. And so these are folks who were interested in this piece of the project. We're also going to be getting their general design ideas on where we should start, right? Because there's a lot of discussion. We've talked about that in the past. You start with a dice mechanic, with a style of play. You start with a general mechanic overall, and then figure out what dice work. We've asked them for their advice on that, because next week we want to start hammering out some actual rules and start sharing that with you guys and getting your feedback on them in the roughest form. So that's going to be happening. Now, let me show you. I've got a couple of show and tell items here. This is the first one. What I wanted to do is share a little bit with you about what it looks like when we are working with our consulting designers. Now, one of the things that's really important in any sort of a relationship like this is making sure that you're going to be clear in your expectations, that you're giving a clear set of instructions on what you're looking for and how you would like it delivered, and when that deliverable should come back. This is super important, because the easier you make it for the people who are working with you, the better the results they're able to give you, because there's no ambiguity in there. Now, one thing we're doing a little bit different in this project, and for those of you who, I see a few folks are just joining, we are going to be getting to some of the mechanic design discussion soon, but we're starting off with a few other topics that are important to a lot of folks. We're doing things a little different. So because this is a consulting position and it's not a work for hire writing the content position, we're not really going by the word. We're going by the hour. And what we're going to do is we have two different ways that we're figuring out the hourly rate, or the amount of time that they're going to be working for us. So one of them is a time boxed work. And time boxed work, and by the way, this is actually the cut and paste of the information that I sent to our consulting designers. So if you're looking at this, you're seeing what they got from us. I said I was going to be as transparent as possible. So this is literally what they were reading. I do want to point out one thing, is that paying by the word, I've never loved that as a system. I just feel like it's an unfortunate way to pay people. For those of you who are in software, it's like paying by the line of code. That doesn't tell you how good the code is. It doesn't tell you how much it's worth. Some people write incredibly succinctly, and that's a talent, and that's a skill, and that deserves to be rewarded. And to write that succinctly sometimes takes them a little longer. But if they're using fewer words, they get paid less. It doesn't make sense to me, right? That's not what we want. What we want is to clearly define what the output is, and then figure out how long it's going to take to do, and give them the time to do it. And so that's why for this, we are partly because of my beliefs around that, but also because they're doing consulting work. We aren't paying by the word for most of this. So one way that we do this is time boxed work. In this case, I asked them to spend 4 hours on the two parts of the task: reviewing the tome of requirements and offering general advice about getting started. Now, in this case, they could break that time up however they wanted. They could spend an hour on the tome, 3 hours on the general advice. They could save 30 minutes to sit down and have a one-on-one with me, that sort of a thing. That's up to them, but we wanted to time box it to about 4 hours. And the reason we're doing this is that we do need to be really careful about how we spend this money, right? I mean, $30,000 is a lot of money, but it goes pretty quickly when you start paying everyone for their work. So we want to be thoughtful and make sure we're using it in the best way. Now, if people come back to me and say, look, I have some more things I want to say, but I need like another hour of work to get it done, oftentimes I'll be fine with that, right? I'll talk to folks, we'll work on that. But sometimes we won't. In this case, we're saying, shoot for 4 hours, do what you can, whatever you can do in 4 hours, that'll work for us, and it'll get us where we need to be. So the second type of work is estimated work. And I lost my header there, but in estimated work, we say, hey, here's what we need you to work on. How long is this going to take you? And they're going to say, I could probably get that done in about 3 hours. We'll be like, okay, that's awesome. Go ahead, give it your best shot, and let me know. Now, if we're like, God, could you try just time boxing it to 2 hours because our budget just doesn't allow it? We could have that sort of conversation. And the other thing is that I know that for me, when I'm working with folks, that sometimes when I'm the one who's doing the consulting, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to spend an extra half hour doing this and just get it done, right? I don't mind. It's not important to me. The amount I'm getting matches the work that I'm doing. So, it gives us more flexibility and space for everyone to work together. If they do estimate, say, 4 hours, and they come back and go, I'm like halfway through, I'm going to need another 2 hours at least. We can talk about that. And that's a really normal relationship in most businesses other than writing. And so I would like to see us do this for this consulting work, but down the road, I'm hoping to do some experiments around writing on projects where we do it this way. And I think it could be very cool. One example is in short fiction. You could offer, say, look, I need a story from 3,000 to 5,000 words. And, what is your rate for that? And then we can go back and forth and figure out a fair rate. So, and thanks, Master of the Game. It was just saying, thanks for sharing this. It's my pleasure. I really want folks to see this, and I think it's really important. And so I'm glad that it's proving useful to some folks. Finally, sharing advice. One of the things here that I made really clear is that we are going to be sharing what they tell us with all of you, because I don't want anyone to be surprised if we say, well, Robin said. But the other thing I wanted to let them know is that this isn't ready for publication text. We're not going to share quotes straight out of their documents with you, unless they look really good and it makes the designer look good, because we don't really want them to feel, really like worried about how they're writing things. We want it to be stream of consciousness. We want to be able to just hammer out notes, not worry if it has a typo or something that we're going to copy and show the world their typos, right? So we stated this here under sharing your advice very clearly, that first, we are going to share it. And second, that we're not going to make them look bad by throwing their raw text out into the world. So now we have what we call our quests. This is what we call our segments of work that we're giving to the consulting designers. And as you can see, we spelled out a summary of what the goal of this piece of work is, because a lot of times if you spell it out specifically what you want, it gets a little bit weird and they give you the wrong thing. They give you exactly what you asked for, and that's not what you really needed. So you sort of spell out what the value is that this is going to deliver, talk about how it's going to help the project, talk about the type of work it is. So how are we going to be paying them, and giving them a due date, right? So you can see here that we are targeting today at 10 p.m. Eastern time as a due date. And of course, if it's a problem, they can let us know. We'll work with them, right? But here you'll see I spelled it all out, because that makes it easier for them to do the work. Also, we asked for part 1 and part 2 of this project. Part 1 was the review, which we talked about, and we clearly defined what the deliverable is, which in this case could be any format they want. They could have a call, they could just type it out, free form text, they could put comments into the document. We left it up to them. And then the second piece of this was the general advice. And again, same concept. So you can see what these emails look like. Now, going forward, these are going to be a lot shorter, because we won't have to include all of this sort of preamble. This is all here because it's the first time we worked with these folks on one of these projects. So that's what that looks like. That's what working with our consulting designers look like. This is how we're managing the project to make sure we're getting clear feedback that we can use in the best possible way, share with you, keep in budget, all of these moving parts, keep the plates all spinning as we move along on this. So moving on, though, let's move on to some other topics here. In terms of the general advice, I'm personally really, really looking forward to this part. I also have talked to Stephen Long, and he and I are going to sit down for about an hour sometime over the next few days to talk through the first steps of design. This is because I want to sort of hear his thoughts of, he's heard a lot of what's going on. He's seen a lot of the conversations. I want to hear his thoughts, because I'll tell you, he is a guy who knows mechanics. He understands the underpinnings of how these games work. A lot of our designers do, but Steve absolutely is very, very good at this. I really trust his talent for coming up with a strong set of core tools, a core framework for this. And I want to hear his thoughts on where he would start on all of this. So he and I are going to sit down and talk. And that gets us in a pretty short or pretty long, 20 minutes. Sorry about that, guys. There was a lot more to cover than I expected. Gets us into talking a little bit about our design topic, which is hit points and wounds. So there's an entire thread dedicated to combat in the over on our Discord. And if you aren't part of the Discord, you can join up. I put the link into the comments. Lots of good conversation going on there, sort of setting the stage for the work that we have coming up for us. So, hit points and wounds. There's a lot of discussion about this and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions about what we should do, right? We don't even have the system in place yet, but this can kind of, we can talk about this on its own. So one of the things that really has come up is the idea of hit points or wounds, right? You have wound systems. Like a good example is Savage Worlds, where when you play Savage Worlds, you take enough damage to damage you past your toughness, then you end up shaken. You take a little more damage and a raise, as they call it, and you end up with a wound. And when you get 3 wounds, you go down, right? It's a system that has wounds. Each of those wounds apply modifiers to your character. So now things become more and more difficult the more wounds you take on. Now, this sounds pretty cool. And actually, we play Savage Worlds in my weekly game right now, demoing we're testing a new campaign setting that we're working on to go along with Ataltis at some point. We've been playing this, and one of the challenges, or one of the things, is that it works pretty well for us, but for other people, it feels like what they were calling a death spiral. This idea that you just gets harder and harder to fight, and you feel less and less heroic, and you're sort of like stumbling along, barely holding it together, and it stops feeling like you're cool and starts feeling like you're just waiting to die, right? I think I've done a pretty good job of summarizing the death spiral, as folks were calling it there. You can correct me in the comments if you think that I'm off on that one, but yeah, it can happen, right? You can end up with that sort of a situation. On one hand, it could feel really fun as you do your Boromir moment, and no matter how many arrows you're like taking in here, you're still like going, no, I'm gonna survive this, man. He keeps fighting, he stumbles forward and takes down another foe, right? Really cool. Or it could just mean, like I said, that you feel like you're just getting slowly whittled down until you're not a hero. You're just this wounded guy stumbling along. On the other hand, you've got hit points, which are very clear, very simple to manage, and don't really take a whole lot of thought to figure out how bad a shape you're in, right? You got 50 hit points, you're down to 25, you're halfway there to being dead, right? It's very clear where you are and straightforward. At the same time, you get into some weird things, like you have it's the old warhorse scenario where you've got the fighter who has more hit points than a healthy warhorse. And does that make sense? Is that what life is like? Does that really represent the world as we know it? Maybe not. Then you get into the arguments of, well, hit points aren't really health. They're actually how well you are at dodging or avoiding the worst of the blow or all these things. So yeah, you start getting explanations, but you often run into these problems. And if you'd like to know, how long discussions about hit points and how they should work and how many people should have been going on, I've brought some show and tell here. Let me bring this up. And this is not a new discussion, and this has been going on in gaming as long as gaming has existed, right? Um, let me just take apparently, apparently everyone just lost audio. I just said some amazing things. I solved all of our problems with combat, and that's it for tonight. No, sorry about that, folks. I didn't realize that was going to cut me out. What I was saying was that the Dave Arneson discussion with hit points feel pretty funny now, because I really did say quite a bit of what I wanted to say there. What Dave Arneson and them were discussing is, do hit points grow? Do you start out with a small number and grow to a large number? Or do you have a set number of hit points over time and then you just get harder to hit as time goes along? That's an interesting take on it, and it's interesting that it's not the direction D&D ended up going, right? It ended up going more to this growing hit points over time, and so there was this whole debate about it. And as you can see, as long as role-playing games have been around, this has been a challenge, right? People haven't agreed on the best way to do it. So I think that what we need to look at, there are a couple of things. Most importantly, we need to look at, is it fun? Right? That's the number one thing, is it fun to play? And we're only going to know that by putting together some test rules and throwing them out there for you guys to try. And is it does it allow you to have a game that feels that has a good flow to it, that has a good a, a good pacing, right? Good pacing. So you're not like getting bogged down, which I guess kind of goes back to, is it fun? But the whole thing is that we wanted to have this richness, this good pacing, this fun experience. And I really, really, really want to challenge everyone to ask themselves if hit points are the best way to do this. Okay. I'm not saying we're not going to do it. Hang on for a second. I should put up my typical warning. Here we go. Brainstorm warning. I'm not saying we should definitely get rid of hit points. But what I am saying is that I challenge every single one of us to ask ourselves if hit points are the right way to do this. Hit points are ubiquitous with games and gaming. They're in video games. They were in Zork. They are in every type of game you can think of. Later Zorks that had some of the extra abilities and things. It had all of this. We see it again and again and again, to the point where people know hit points is sort of like a cultural concept. But maybe there's a better way, right? If you read up on some of the history, hit points came out of a naval combat system that had to do with ships and how much damage a ship could take, and bigger ships had more hit points. Maybe there's a better way we can represent this. And other games have done this, like Savage Worlds. Maybe there's a way we can get the best of both worlds, where we can get wounds that, here's the thing that I want, is I want to be able to play a game where you have the character say, my arm, I've taken a blow to my arm. What do I do? And you could have somebody run over and bandage that arm up and get it back working again as best as possible. But later another blow hits it. I read a whole series of Spider-Man comics from the 70s where every issue he had to remember that he got shot in the shoulder and it kept coming back to haunt him for a while. Those sorts of things can create wonderful stories in a dungeon adventure, for example. But you've got to have a way to do it that doesn't bog you down or create that sense of, I'm just a walking wounded. I'm not a hero anymore, right? We've got to keep them as heroes. The other thing, so let me get back to some of my notes. I would go off on that for a while, but I think that we can definitely find better options. So I'm going to talk a little bit about straight numbers versus vague concepts, right? There was a lot of talk about straight numbers coming from your stats and abilities, adding a group of numbers together into a block of points that represent when you die. There was also the talk of plot points, right? Really going away from the idea of measuring the wound, but looking at the number of points that you have before you need to remove yourself from the combat. That if you stay in the combat at that point, you get injured. That goes along with the whole idea of party points, where the party has a pool of points, right? And they have to drop out, or if they lose enough, they die. I have to say that those make me nervous. I love them, but they make me nervous from a design perspective for a game like this, because I feel like we end up wandering a little bit into unknown territory, a little farther into untested regions than we may want to get. And so I'm not saying we can't do that. We should certainly take a look at trying some of those things, but I want to be cautious about that, right? It definitely gets us into the territory where it might be difficult for people to wrap their heads around the concepts because they're too new for them. But like I said, I also want to make sure we don't lose some of the richness of saying, like, when your leg gets injured, you're limping for a while, right? I mean, how do you get around that? The injuries suffered by John McClane in Die Hard made the film. Every injury started to affect him, and it made the story because it became the challenges he had to overcome. But that does bring up the idea of, do we want gritty and realistic, or do we want more light and heroic and quick? That's going to be something that in the survey that I'm working on for all of you, you're going to be answering for me. That's going to be the next thing that I want to talk about. Is I want to talk about the vibe, the sense of style for the game, because I want to hear from you guys what you're looking for. Now, to a certain extent, we're going to be able to tweak that with dials, assuming we design this right, but it's still going to have sort of that underlying set of principles that are going to give a certain style of play. I am curious, for anyone who's listening, let me know what your thought is on, what's your preference on a style of play? Do you like to see a lot more realism and like the potential of bleeding out and trying to bandage wounds during the middle of combat and limping about? Or do you like something more where it's like comic books where they're in one scene they're getting shot, my Spider-Man story aside, and the next they're going right back into the fight and doing more cool adventuring type of stuff? I mean, we're going to need to hear from you, and you can tell me right now what your thoughts are. Another thing I found, though, in terms of wounds, and this is some of the feedback we received, is a lot of people seem to have had bad experiences with wound systems. And I find that interesting. Shadowrun, Savage Worlds, doesn't matter which of these systems it was. For every person who's like, yeah, it was kind of cool, there were just as many who were like, no, I really don't like it. So I find that to me to be fascinating, that for some reason, wound systems often rub people the wrong way, right? It rubs them the wrong way. Master of the Game was just noting to us here in the comments that he likes realism, but having very rare occasional wounds, injuries, or madness that can happen, which is kind of interesting, because now what we start talking about is a wound as a story point as opposed to a measure of how long you can live, right? And in books and movies, that really is how wounds function. They aren't necessarily there so when the character is going to die. They're there to bring the story forward, to move the adventure forward, to keep the tale moving and give you a cool thing to deal with. And so maybe that's a big part of what we need to think about, is we have to ask ourselves, does the system drive the story? And that's again, we've said that many times as being something that's really important. I'm going to bring up a comment here just because I think it's worth sharing out. Let me just drop this one in here. Another one from Master of the Games. I think most of the system that wounds happen too frequently or often have a huge impact on play and make combat become a slog. I think that's it, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying, is that it becomes the wound game as opposed to the cool leaping across the table, swinging across the rope game. And that ceases to be fun really fast, doesn't it? When you're just playing your wounds. Yeah, absolutely. I can see that, right? That's a real problem. And that is, one of the big things that came up again and again in the Discord is the slowing down of the game through wounds, right? People would be like, yeah, wounds are great, but the game just bogs down with them. So I think that that's a really good point. Another thing, though, that someone brought up in the Discord that I thought was really, really cool was this discussion of survivability, that you set an expectation when you design the game at the very beginning on what the survivability of the characters are. Do you think that these characters are going to make it through every adventure? And, there's going to be threats to them, and wounds and injuries will slow them down, but it probably won't kill them, right? Or is this going to be one of those things where like they might not make it out each time they play? Is it going to be the 4 hit point wizard from D&D who is lucky to make it out of their first dungeon and you're just praying they make it to 5th level, right? Or the GURPS game where you take some grievous injury that you're just done, right? It takes you out of the game. That's a very different feel from the more adventurous vibe. And I have to say that it seems like most players today are looking for something that's more of an adventure and less of a gritty simulation, as much fun as that can be for some of us, And so I think that, again, these are the questions you guys are going to see in our upcoming survey that we'll be sending out after this weekend, because that is an important part of what we need to figure out. So talking about all of this, if I were to start making some predictions, and I'm going to start making some predictions, I think that we're going to end up with a system that uses a combination of easily measurable health, whether that's hit points or some other means of measuring how soon do I die and how many hits can I take, right? Because you have to remember that in real life, you have pain and bleeding and those sorts of sensations to help you figure out when you're going to die. In the role-playing game, you don't have those, so we need to simulate those, and hit points are kind of the way that we know that, right? When we've got 3 hit points left out of 50, we're like, we're in bad shape, man. I just want to go home, right? So I think we're going to have hit points in some way or some form of easily measurable system, but a story-driven set of wounds that keeps the story moving, that becomes an interesting part of the game. Remember, one of our tome of requirements is that a rule should only exist and a mechanic should only exist if it drives the game forward, if it has a value and a purpose in the game. And if the purpose is just to simulate what really happens, that's not really going to work, right? Based on our requirements. Instead, it has to have a value in the game, and that value can be a story value. So when John McClane walks on the glass because he doesn't have any shoes and has to spend the rest of the game worrying about his feet, how are we going to represent that so that it's fun and drives the adventure and drives the story and serves as a challenge for the heroes to overcome, versus a thing that bogs it down, and every time you try to make a run, it slows you down and you can't actually do anything cool, right? So I think we're going to have some sort of a mix of the two. I think they both have to be there based on the feedback we've heard, but I don't think it's going to be a purely wound-based system. This is my prediction at the moment. I should probably get a prediction banner to go across the bottom as well. So one more thing that I want to just talk about and just throw out an idea for folks to think about. So those of you who are watching this now and want to join the brainstorm over on Discord or want to jump in here, one thing I want to talk about is the difference between a counting down versus a counting up system. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is when you stop thinking about hit points as a set of points you have before you die versus a building threat. So if you take damage and you have damage slowly increase over time, but not have a guaranteed death point, you create an interesting sort of press your luck scenario where each time you take more damage, it makes it harder to survive the next injury you take. And I think that that's an interesting thing for us to think about and play with. So that's everyone's homework for this design journal, is give a little thought to a counting up system as opposed to a counting down system. As opposed to saying 3 wounds and you're out, say each wound makes it harder to survive the next one. Instead of saying 0 hit points as you're out, say 0 damage and you're healthy, 20 damage and you might be in really big trouble. Push it to 30 damage and you'll be lucky to take 1 more hit point without dying. So a little bit of design homework for everyone to take home. Come over to the Discord, talk to us about it. I'm going to post that there as well as a challenge for people to talk about. I think it's something that could be very cool for all of us. So in the meantime, this is not going to be a full hour tonight. Some nights will go half an hour. Some nights will go more. Next week's probably going to be a little busier because we're going to have quite a few new things to share based on the feedback we get from the consulting designers and some of our early design work. But for this week, that's all that we've got. In the meantime, come over to Facebook, come over to the Discord. We look forward to talking to you. Watch for those surveys that are going out now, and we will talk to you again next week as we talk some more about our very cool game that we're all putting together that will someday have a cool name. Thanks, everyone.